Hello again, Lloyd Rieber here with my next video in my workshop on an introduction to Q methodology. All right, well, you have chosen a good topic that is appropriate for Q, and you have written a good research question to guide your research. You've done the hard work of constructing a concourse on your topic, and you've also done the hard work of defining and identifying your Q set, also known as the Q sample, that fairly represents your concourse in a balanced way. Next, you need to make all of the specific decisions related to the particular method you are going to be using in your study. For example, what will be the shape of your Q-sort grid? How many participants do you need? How are you going to select those participants? What other kinds of data collection might be necessary, such as interviews and other qualitative data to help you interpret the results? Perhaps you ought to be considering some other surveys to collect demographic data so you have an idea of how to better understand your participants as you do the interpretation later. So these are all important steps and decisions to make in the process of doing a Q methodological study. Note that this presentation will follow Chapter 4 in the book by Simon Watts and Paul Stenner titled Doing the Fieldwork, Participants, Materials, and Procedures. I think you'll find this chapter to be one you'll want to read and reread many times as you're preparing your materials because it gives such good practical advice. And of course, this presentation is just going to hit the highlights of some of the key points of the chapter and by no means is a substitute for reading the chapter. Okay, let's get started. Here again is my little pocket guide to Q methodology, and as I've already said, you've completed steps 1 by 3 by now, right? The next step is to conduct the Q sort with participants, number 4. Now there's a lot of decisions wrapped up in number 4, so let's kind of take a look at some of those. One of the most basic questions is what shape should your Q sort grid be? There's a lot of advice out there in the Q world. It's kind of interesting actually because you'll see and read a lot of advice that says in many ways it doesn't really matter what shape to choose. But I think one of the most important things that it does need to be a non-bizarre symmetrical shape, which is what Watts and Stenner refer to. I prefer this normal curve-like shape that you see here. Again, it looks like an upside down normal curve. Now, we obviously have some options about how tall it is and also how wide it is. And I think the book gives some really good suggestions about the fact that if you are going to be administering this Q sort to people who are unfamiliar with the topic, probably the shape on the left-hand side, something that resembles more of a steeper and taller grid shape would be appropriate, mainly because it gives more opportunities for the middle ground, where people can put more of the statements toward the middle, which obviously means that they're not as familiar with it, so they're going to be less certain. But if you have a group of people who probably have some very strong opinions or know something about the topic, they recommend that a flatter and shorter distribution that you see on the right-hand side there. And that kind of forces the people who, again, should know a little bit more about this topic or have more definite opinions, really begin to tease out what their position really is. You'll also read about questions of, do I really need to force people to actually put the statements in this particular grid? What if somebody wants to actually have 3 statements in the +5 or -5 column? Again, you'll read that it probably doesn't matter that much in terms of the statistical analysis, but I'm going to strongly recommend you keep to a forced sort structure for your studies. I think it makes it easier to defend this in a dissertation type environment. I also prefer the classic numbering system that you see here, going from, in this case, -5 to +5 with 0 in the middle. And that doesn't mean that 0 is like the pivot point. This is something that the book talked about. It's simply a numbering system. Now, one might argue maybe we should just go from 1 to 11. And from, again, the statistics point of view, that doesn't really matter. I think it just depends on how you think it's going to communicate to the individuals. And I can see some value in actually thinking about going for like 1 to 11 versus -5 to +5. But again, my advice is going to be to kind of keep to the more standard version, which is this uh, the negative number to the positive number with 0 in the middle. Another issue, which I find kind of interesting because it seems so simple, but yet there is some disagreement. You'll see in the shape there on the right that the labeling goes from most agree on the right to most disagree on the left. And I've seen this also written as, say, most agree to least agree. And it's an interesting question because maybe I do agree with all of the statements, and it's just a matter of less agreement than more agreement. Uh, Again, I don't think it's going to matter tremendously. I think you should give some thought to that. I've done it both ways. I think people kind of understand what is meant by those labels either way. But anyhow, it's something to think about. And yes, do take care in preparing your materials. It's, again, a kind of an interesting question. I'm going to use the context of us preparing print-based materials for people to do a Q sort. And I think the recommendation that you actually use heavier cardstock for the statements is a good one. Again, if the door should open and a gust of wind would come through and you were just using slips of paper for the statements, they all may just get blown away. So I think the feel of the statements, the statement cards, is kind of important. You want this to be a good tactile experience. Also, the size of the cards, I think, is an important consideration. And this is where, like you see in this little graphic here of a person using most of the table in order to do the sort. Now, I know many of you will be quick to point out that that first Q sort that we did in this workshop on food preferences was probably a very poor example of what I just said. I think it violated a lot of those particular pieces of advice. Well, I did want you to have your very first Q sort to be a paper-based example. And since I typically do this workshop online, I had to send you the materials as a Word doc. When I do this workshop face-to-face, I do prepare materials that meet those characteristics, for example, by using statements that are actually printed on cardstock. Also, a little reminder too, and many people forget to do this if they're not careful, you do want to randomize the order of your statements. So if you have done a good job selecting your Q set and you use a structured approach for selecting your statements, you want to be careful that you don't have all the items associated with one particular viewpoint or one particular concept or principle of the Q sample all lumped together. So one of the last steps you should do is actually completely randomize the statement order so that there's really no rhyme or reason why statement 1 followed by 2 followed by 3 are in that particular order. And I really want to emphasize just how important the pre-sort is. Now that you have done a couple of Q sorts with me, I hope you really agree with this, that the pre-sorting activity where the participant very quickly takes a look at each of the statements and puts them into one of three piles without really thinking too hard and not worrying about how many statements are going into those three piles. So that when you're done, you have three piles with one of, well, here are statements I generally agree with, those that I generally disagree with, and then all of the other statements in the middle. I think this is really important on many levels. One, it very quickly gets the participant very familiar with all of the statements without, really any stress or worry. They're just taking a look at each one. But then more of a divide and conquer kind of approach. They already know that each pile, they have a sense of what they think about those particular statements. And I really do think that makes the actual final sorting much easier and much more satisfying for the participant to do. So do not overlook this important step. And I really can't emphasize enough just how important it is to be gathering other types of qualitative data during the session that you are holding with the participant. So in a face-to-face type of session where you might be doing it with a individual participant or maybe a small group, you have, again, lots of decisions to make and lots of opportunities. If it's one-on-one, obviously you have the opportunity to conduct a nice interview after the sorting takes place. You can also be observing in a one-on-one type of situation and getting a sense of what the participant is struggling with and maybe consider the idea of having them talk through some of those. And again, you have to be careful with this, and this can take some experience. It may or may not be a good idea to be interrupting the participant while they do the Q sort itself. So you have to kind of think about what would make the most sense. Obviously, if you're doing this in an online type of environment, you are much more restricted in how you can collect that particular data. I think you already know that at a very minimum, you would be asking some open-ended survey questions about their reasoning for why they put the statements that they did at the far left and the far right of the Q sort grid, and then any other comments you can have them make. Believe me, when it comes time for the interpretation, you will be very happy that you took the time to really think through what kind of qualitative data you would like to have from that participant while you actually have access to them. Remember, in most Q studies, once they have completed the Q session, they're gone. You may never have access to them again. I think it's also very important to consider other kinds of data or information that you'd like to gather on the individuals. I think an obvious example would be demographic information. This is actually a good place to use what we've been calling R-type surveys, because R-type surveys are really good for collecting objective data. So, for example, if I were doing a Q study on the viewpoints of perhaps elementary school teachers, I may want to know something about what is their age, how many years they've been teaching, maybe what grade level they teach, what subjects they teach. And, a lot of times we will ask for gender, and I always make sure I indicate to people that you need to have a rationale for all of the data you're collecting. Sometimes it's just easy to collect. Why is gender important? Well, to use the example of viewpoints of elementary school teachers, I used to be an elementary school teacher, and it turned out that I was one of very, very few male teachers in not just the school, but the school district. And so getting the viewpoints of male teachers in an elementary school might actually be a very important part of the data collection, because there's maybe a rationale that perhaps gender does play a role in some of those viewpoints. But again, I think the main idea here is what other kinds of data, in this case, objective data, would be good to know about your participants, so that when you go and do the interpretation, you can use the demographic data to help you in that interpretation. A question that comes up almost immediately in doing any kind of research is, how many participants do I need? One of the, I think, benefits or values of Q methodology is that you really don't need very many participants. As you now know, in Q, we can have both single participant studies and multiple participant studies. So really here, what I'm talking about is how many participants are needed in a multiple participant study. If we were doing an R-type factor analysis, you will see in the literature that you would probably need hundreds of participants in order to have results that are valid. But in Q, you don't, because we are following the qualitative tradition in so many ways when we do a Q study. There is, I think, a nice guideline or rule of thumb that says you need to aim for at least half as many participants as you have statements. But again, that's a general rule. Obviously, if you have far less than that, you just don't have enough data from which to sufficiently reveal the most important or dominant viewpoints that might exist about that topic. So that's again, I think, a pretty good rule of thumb. And you might also ask, why not just have as many participants as you can possibly find? Why not have hundreds of people complete the Q sort? One, you don't need to, so that's probably the best reason. But the reason also is that it just becomes wasted data. You will reveal the main viewpoints that exist very quickly, given a number as represented here, at least half as many as there are statements. And so it just becomes wasted data. The other main difference between say a Q study and a traditional R-type study is that we need to give much consideration to how participants are chosen. Indeed, we are again going to be following the qualitative tradition and use what is called purposive sampling, meaning we're going to actually be very intentional and deliberate in determining who we want to be part of our particular study. In an R-type study, you'll hear lots about random selection and random assignment, that we have a population of people, and I want to be able to generalize to that entire population. So I'm going to sample that population in in a random type of way. Not so in Q. So again, going back to my example of a study involving elementary school teachers, maybe I do want to consider having some teachers who are new or almost new in their first few years of teaching, as well as experienced teachers. Maybe I do want to have grade levels from across the spectrum of an elementary school represented by those teachers. And again, as I mentioned earlier, depending on what your research question is, maybe gender is important and you want to have representation of both male and female. Of course, gender is now quite a fluid thing in the research, so we again have to keep that in mind as well if we are going to be considering gender as a variable. Okay, that's it. It's now time to get busy developing your materials and finding appropriate people to participate in your study that will allow you to answer your research question. Until next time.